Good morning, everyone. Great to see so many of you here on a Sunday morning. The story of my relationship with The Passenger goes back to a day I was sitting in my office in Houston as General Director of Houston Grand Opera. It must have been, I would say, in late 2008. And we were doing a production of a show called Chorus at the time, which was a fully staged presentation of choruses from different operas. It was directed by David Patner, and it was designed by Johann Engels. And Johann Engels arrived in my office unexpectedly to tell me about a piece called The Passenger that he and David Patner had rediscovered and that they were planning on doing at the Bregenz Festival in Austria in 2010. Johann knew something of my background, and I'm happy to talk about that a little later, and said, you need to get to know this piece. David then arrived a couple of hours later and said, I hear Johann's been talking to you about The Passenger. Let me tell you about it too. And David, to a very real degree, rediscovered this piece and believed in it so strongly that he wanted to direct it himself and present it at the Bregenz Festival, of which he was the intendant, the general director. And I remember him giving me a copy of a translation of the libretto and reading it on a flight a few days later. And I was so entranced by this libretto and so moved by this libretto that I actually started crying on the flight. And that really does not happen to me very often. I should say that, shockingly, Johann Engels, who is the designer of this production, died unexpectedly 2 days ago. It was a terrible shock. I had a call from David Patner Friday morning to tell me that Johann had died at home in the UK. And so we'll be dedicating our performances of The Passenger to Johann. But fast forward from my office in Houston and my flight reading this libretto to the Bregenz Festival in 2010 when I went to see it. And it was a piece that absolutely blew me away. I was expecting it to be moving, expecting it to be powerful. I wasn't expecting it to be as mature and introspective as it was. Let me tell you a bit about my background. I was born in London. My parents were both Hungarian, refugees from Hungary. My father was a refugee from Hungary in 1939, so he got out of Hungary before World War II. My mother was not so fortunate. She was from a different part of Hungary. They didn't know each other then. She was moved into a ghetto in Győr, it's an industrial city halfway between Vienna and Budapest. She was deported to Auschwitz in '44, which was the last great wave of deportations. She survived. She was taken on the march of death from Auschwitz into Germany when the Nazis wanted to evacuate the camps in the face of the approaching Soviet army. She was liberated in Germany by the American army and eventually got to Britain in 1947 as a refugee. And she and my father met in Britain in the early 50s. And so an opera about the Holocaust is something that resonates with me very strongly, but not perhaps for obvious reasons. I'm actually very cynical about works of art inspired by the Holocaust. It seems to me that most of them are sentimental, melodramatic, simplistic. Most of them don't begin to try to understand the vast complexity of this subject. The Passenger seems to me to be one of the rare exceptions. And it was really with that in mind that I came away from the performances of it that I saw in Bregenz that summer in 2010 thinking, this is an extraordinary piece. I really want to try to champion it. While I was still general director in Houston, I planned for it to come to Houston, where it had its US premiere in January of this year. So I was already happily established here in Chicago, and the piece happened in Houston after I left. Another project that I had started when I was still in Houston was to take The Passenger to Lincoln Center Festival, where it went in July of this year. It played at the Park Avenue Armory in New York. And so when The Passenger arrives in Chicago in February of next year as the final opera of Lyric's current season, it will have established itself significantly in the United States. Having had its world-staged premiere in Bregenz in 2010, it has then since been seen in Madrid, in Warsaw, in London, in a couple of cities in Germany, and there are plans for it to be seen in many other operatic centers. So I must say I believe that it deserves the exposure it has had. In many cases, when an unknown opera is encountered for the first time, you discover upon encountering it why it was unknown. In the case of The Passenger, I believe that actually it has been unjustly neglected and absolutely deserves to take its place as a major 20th century masterpiece.
Just looking at the name of the composer, we already have a sense of the complexity. And if we can talk a little bit about his biography, because this audience knows more than many audiences might, but there's still, we have either from our own families and experience, some connection or some knowledge, we think, of the very complicated and very dark story that led to some happiness, though at the end of the Freud family in England. But we have to remember, too, that emigration, refugeeism, etc., went in many directions. And a very large number of people in Poland and other Central European countries, for political or ethnic religious reasons, went east and not west. So Weinberg is a Polish composer. Being a Jew from Poland, he has a German or Yiddish name because those were the names that people were given when Jews started being given surnames. And his first name, Mieczysław, is obviously a Polish name, and yet he was working in and died, I believe, in the Soviet Union. So maybe you can say a bit about him.
Mieczysław Weinberg was born in Warsaw in 1919, on December 8th, as it happens. When the Nazis invaded in 1939, he escaped to the east. It was his only way out of Poland. There was no safe way out of Poland to the west. Most of his family were murdered in the Holocaust. He made his way first to Minsk and then to Moscow. He spent the rest of his life in Moscow, where he died in 1996. He became a victim of Stalin's anti-Semitic purges in the Soviet Union, survived, was a great friend of Shostakovich, who was, I think, 11 years his senior. And Shostakovich was a great mentor and champion of Weinberg's. And what's now clear is that each influenced the other. I think you hear a lot of Shostakovich in Weinberg, but you also can hear in Shostakovich a lot of Weinberg's musical instincts, his instinct to explore Eastern European folk music, his instinct to explore klezmer, both of which form an inherent part of the musical style of The Passenger. The Passenger was Weinberg's first opera, and he had a huge output. He wrote 22 full symphonies, a number of chamber symphonies, many string quartets, oratorios, songs, instrumental music, 7 operas, of which The Passenger was the first. It was commissioned by the Bolshoi in the early 60s. And when it was completed in 1968 and planned to be performed at the Bolshoi, it was suppressed by the Soviet authorities. And every attempt to perform it for the rest of the Soviet era, both in Russia and elsewhere, was similarly suppressed, which is why it had its world staged premiere in 2010 in Bregenz. The Passenger is set on an ocean liner on a journey from West Germany to Brazil. On board is a West German diplomat, Walter, and his wife, Lisa. And the two of them married shortly after the end of World War II. They didn't know each other before then. A couple of days into the journey, Lisa goes absolutely pale when she thinks she recognizes a fellow passenger. And what emerges is that, unknown to her husband, Lisa was an SS overseer in Auschwitz, and the passenger she thinks she recognizes is Marta, a former inmate whose death she thought she had brought about. And so the piece is about victim and perpetrator. The opera then moves from the ocean liner to Auschwitz itself, to the women's camp in Auschwitz. Interestingly, Weinberg chose to tell his Holocaust opera through non-Jewish protagonists. Marta is a Polish nationalist. She has been imprisoned in Auschwitz for her liberal views, along with her fiancé, a violinist, Tadeusz. We never know, we the audience, never know whether Marta in fact survived Auschwitz. We never know whether she really is on that ship, is really someone who has been recognized by Lisa, or whether she's a figment of Lisa's imagination and increasingly Lisa's overwhelming guilt. The opera is about Lisa and her guilt as much as it is about Marta and her comrades in Auschwitz.
Two things from that, and then maybe we can look at a tiny sampler. We don't want to give everything away of the way this turns out musically. Weinberg did his own libretto and was the creator of the opera, but it's... He did not. I'm sorry.
No.
Let me jump ahead, and then you can fill both in. I wanted to say the inspiration, of course, is a radio play and a novel, and the author actually is still living, and she's been at a number of... She's a Polish writer in her 90s, and she's been at a number of the performances. So maybe we can say a little bit about the background of the story and what Weinberg and his about-to-be-named librettist did with it. And my apologies on that.
Sure. Sofia Pozmich is a Polish writer in her 90s, as Andrew says. And she was in Auschwitz as a prisoner, as a liberal. She is Catholic and a Polish nationalist. And she, it is said, was inspired to write her play, The Passenger in Cabin 45, which was initially a radio play and a novel, when she happened to be visiting Paris years later, I think in the early 60s or late 50s, and happened to hear a group of German tourists somewhere in Paris with a woman shouting in German some instructions to her fellow tourists. And instantly, this experience plunged Sofia Pozmich back into Auschwitz, where she reimagined the commands of the SS overseer, who became the character Lisa. And she intentionally told her own Auschwitz story through the eyes and ears of the SS overseer Lisa. It was Shostakovich who first came across the novel by Pozmich, which soon after it was published was translated into Russian, and it was Shostakovich who gave it to Weinberg. The Russian writer Alexander Medvedev is in fact the librettist. He is someone with whom Weinberg had worked. He read the novel, immediately saw its possibilities as an opera, changed it, added a number of characters, very importantly added the epilogue, and we should talk a little bit about the epilogue a little later, because what emerged from this novel was an opera that I believe is fundamentally about the survival of humanity against impossible odds. Of course, an opera on this subject has some disturbing, violent scenes, but my experience in having now been to a number of performances of The Passenger is that I always come away from it remembering the much softer, much more lyrical, much more reflective sections of the score. And the epilogue is indeed something that transports us out of the realism of either the ocean liner or the women's camp in Auschwitz. All of a sudden, we are on the bank of a great river. Marta, now dressed in modern contemporary clothes, is singing a lament to the friends and comrades that she lost in Auschwitz, promising never to forget them. And let's actually take a look at...
Can we take a look, Matt, at that set of three scenes?
This is a montage of three different scenes. The first scene is the first encounter between Marta and Tadeusz in a storeroom in Auschwitz. They were imprisoned in the same time. They knew they were there. They hadn't seen each other for 2 years. And this is their first encounter. The second moment is Lisa on board the ship, in which she says to her husband, I'm not scared of anyone judging me except for you. I don't want you to leave me. You must tell me if you believe that what I have done is catastrophically wrong. And the final moment that we'll see is part of Marta's lament, the very, very end of this opera. The film is from the 2010 Bregenz premiere, and it was televised, and as it happens, it's actually available on a commercial DVD. What that will tell you is that the musical world is very much mid-20th century Russian. Those of you who are familiar with Shostakovich will recognize that the musical worlds are parallel. I think also we get a sense of Weinberg's mastery as an orchestrator. He has written this piece for large orchestra, large chorus. It's a big piece in every way. Let me say a word or two about language. The original language of the opera was Russian. And David Pountney in Bregenz made a very radical and, in my view, a very inspired choice to present the opera with the characters all singing in their own languages. And one of the reasons for his decision was that Weinberg portrayed Auschwitz as a cosmopolitan hell, in that the characters in the camp are identified specifically in relation to their origins. And some of the music that they sing has characteristics of their nationalities. And so we at Lyric in Chicago will be presenting the multiple language version of the opera. And so through the course of the performance, we will hear Polish, Russian, German, Greek, Czech, Yiddish, French, and English. There will be English language supertitles for those of you who are not fluent in all of those languages.
A couple quick questions about that, and then a few reflections before we go back into the opera itself. This will be the U.S. premiere of the multi-language version.
It will. When I was in Houston, I had planned this version, but my successors decided to perform it in English, which was how it was performed at English National Opera in London a few years ago. So yes, this will be the first time in the US that it will have been performed in this multiple language version.
And the production, Bregenz, England, Houston, New York, Chicago, is it the same production? Is it a varied obviously the Armory was a different space than a
It's the
proscenium
same
house.
production,
Right.
directed by David Pountney. It has exactly the same production and design team, as it happens, as Lyric's new Ring Cycle, which we will be beginning in the fall of 2016. David Pountney will be around for some of the rehearsals. We have a completely different cast here, and that's something that I'm very excited about. Amanda Majeski, who is a former artist of the Rhine Opera Center, who is herself a Polish-American, entirely Polish background, will be singing Marta.
Entirely Polish background from Gurnee, Illinois, just
There you
so
go.
we're clear. Yeah.
There you go. Brandon Jovanovic will be singing Walter.
Of Balkan background from Montana. But
Right.
Yes, but that's all a part of it.
And Sir Andrew Davis will be conducting, and
Yeah.
I'm very excited about that too. He's someone who has really explored this piece at my encouragement and is really taken with it and really excited about it.
How many of you saw Capriccio this season at Lyric? And how many of you saw Don Giovanni? So you're well aware that this isn't type when Anthony is speaking about Sir Andrew and his connection to pieces. I particularly mentioned Capriccio, which of course he's done before. In fact, I think it was the very first opera he conducted professionally.
41 years ago.
Yeah. But if you looked at him at the end of Don Giovanni, you saw that it's genuine, but the, the joy. But at the end of Capriccio, which certainly is not an unhappy ending, you saw his almost magnetic pull down back into the orchestra as he signaled the people who we couldn't see their bows because they're in the pit. And that's the way he works just outside of that core. And of course, Bel Canto, a world premiere, is being developed with him from the very beginning. This he's treating in the same way. And it's not just a question of, oh, does Lyric have a good or very good or great music director? It's that he's a music director. He's totally involved and understands that music tells a story as well as a libretto.
And at the same time as conducting The Passenger, he'll also be conducting Wagner's Tannhäuser. And for me, that's
basically the same story.
Well, it's a very interesting juxtaposition.
Yes.
Seriously, I mean, I'm very conscious of the fact that where we are putting Wagner and Weinberg next to each other. I don't want to labor the point, and I don't want to be overly clever about it, but I hope people will find it stimulating and interesting to experience those two pieces at the same time.
That relates too to some of the points that we're sort of, this is journey with a plural. These are several journeys within the story of the opera, within the story of the passenger, as it takes on its own story in Weinberg's story. And there's a few points of things that Anthony brought up that I just would like to throw out there to keep thinking about. We could talk for 10 hours, literally, about all the things that come up from this opera. One of them is Shostakovich. And we probably all in this room can find a full range of opinion about his music. People who love it more than others, than any other, people who just can't bear it. There are people who like the chamber music, the opera, and so on. We forget often that he really was a man of the theater, and he wasn't allowed to fully develop in that direction because of his situation in the Soviet Union. But his works for the theater are each remarkable. You may have seen televised The Nose, which is his very Gogolian, crazy pastiche of fantasy. Lady Macbeth of the Mtsensk district, which is both Macbeth and Soviet and political. Some of you may have seen at Chicago Opera Theater, Moscow Cheremiska district, which is kind of a musical. And then there's a movie where he actually did a musical score. Then, of course, he starts backing off from a lot of the public and theatrical things because of the situation with Stalin and even his successors. But he's an intellect, despite what his critics might say, and he sees this piece, and it resonates on the human side, the psychological side, the music side, and he says to Weinberg, knowing he's giving a Holocaust novel by a Pole to a Jew in the Soviet Union, this is something you need to explore and think about. And those layers I find fascinating.
Let me read you a couple of
Please.
sentences from a piece that Shostakovich wrote about The Passenger as a kind of explanation of its point. He said, as the echo of her voices fades away, we also fail and fade. These words by the French communist and poet Paul Éluard were selected by the authors of the opera as a motto. The appeal to memory, i.e. to the very conscience each of us holds, masks a deeper sense. In order that past scares shall never recur, we must remember this past and preserve a holy freedom. So that, I think,
yes,
encompasses the point of The Passenger. Your reference, Andrew, to Shostakovich's breadth is also mirrored in Weinberg's life. Mm-hmm. He wrote more than 60 movie scores. Yeah. He also wrote an operetta. He also wrote a musical. Mm-hmm. And it's interesting how the two composers' creative lives seemed constantly intertwined. I read somewhere that they actually had a private competition to see which of them could get to their 10th string quartet first. Shostakovich won, I think, just.
I believe in the Pacifica set of the Shostakovich quartets, there's at least one of the Weinberg quartets. It's a very nice set because with each one they have two Shostakovich and one by another contemporary. And that's another big, big part of all of this, the past of the past. The story of the Holocaust, the story of that era has its own stories. And we have become accustomed to 2 or 3 or 4 or 10 canonical stories, for lack of a better term. And we forget that there are many missed stories. This novel was out there. Think of Vladimir Spielmann and The Pianist. That book was published almost immediately after the war. He lived another 40, 50 years, but it wasn't until Polanski and others said, let's make a movie of this, that the book then returns. Books were published around the world. Elie Wiesel's Night was a very, very different book when it was published in Buenos Aires in Yiddish than it was 10 or so years later when it was published in English with a much more non-Jewishy approach. Imre Kertész's Fateless and Fatelessness, again, out for a very long time. Not until he won the Nobel Prize do we get this Hungarian take. These stories have always been out there, and we have taken certain stories and not engaged yet with them. And that's another thing, aside from the musical accomplishment, that this set of events will allow people to do, is to start thinking about a story they think they know from additional angles. I just want to throw that in there.
Well, there's a very interesting point, again, that relates to what Andrew is saying in The Passenger, and it's, I think, the perfect moment for us to cue up our second excerpt. The climax of the piece, and a real demonstration of Medvedev and Weinberg's theatrical mastery, is the scene in which Tadeusz, the fiancé of Marta, who is known within the camp to have wanted to be a concert violinist, is instructed to play the commandant's favorite waltz at a concert that is being held as some sort of celebration of the commandant in Auschwitz. It's an extraordinary scene. During the course of the previous scenes in the opera, we have discovered that Lisa, the SS overseer, has attempted to be able to bring Marta under her control in order to exert even greater control over the prisoners, and is attempting to use Marta as a pawn in order to keep order in the women's camp. She discovers the encounter that we saw a moment from between Marta and Tadeusz, and realizes that they are lovers, and is trying to entice them to meet again with her unofficial permission, in order that she then is able to manipulate the situation to her advantage. Tadeusz refuses her offers of brokering another encounter with Marta, in spite of the fact that he longs to see Marta, because he is not prepared to put himself into a situation in which he feels that any member of the Nazis is able to exert any sort of hold over him. So when he receives his instruction to play the commandant's favorite waltz at the party, he has no option but to agree. And he takes a violin from the storeroom and arrives at the party, and the party is watched by not only the SS officers but also the female inmates. And at the moment that he is instructed to play this banal piece of music, which we, the audience, have heard in the previous scene, he decides instead to play the Bach chaconne from the second partita. And what this moment represents, and it's truly a breathtaking moment in performance, it is the triumph of great German culture in the face of the appalling circumstances of the Third Reich. And you'll hear that the partita, the chaconne, begins with Tadeusz playing the solo violin. It is then taken up by the full strings in the orchestra, and then you'll see what happens next.
Spiel dem Kommandanten den Walz hervor! Spiele wie vor Gott dem Herrn Du wirst dich bald mit ihm treffen. Fang an!
So that's the scene that then leads straight into the epilogue with Marta sitting on the bank of the river.
And again, we have this back and forth. Whose culture is it? Where did the culture come from? Who's defending the culture? Who's opposing the culture? Who interpreted the culture? And as heavy as that scene was, I've not seen it before, and I've read about it, but it's very heavy. It's not fiction in the sense of the real stories of musicians in the camps. If you have a very strong soul and stomach, read the biography that came out just about 4 or 5 years ago of Alma Rosé, the niece of Gustav Mahler and the daughter of Arnold Rosé, the violinist, who, among other things, in her deportation, was an organizer of the Ladies' Orchestra of Auschwitz. And when she was served accidentally tin fish with some botulism or something in it, she became ill and died. I believe it was Himmler. I sometimes get my Nazis confused. Went out of his mind. How could you let her die? While they're sitting in a banquet hall by the crematoria, etc., these layers and layers of Germans, Jews, Poles, Russians, Greeks, ... And again, we see this back and forth confronted, captured by the whole idea of this opera.
And this also relates to another Chicago Humanities Festival session last week with Martin Amis talking about his novel, The Zone of Interest. which is on a similar subject but from a very different perspective. I recently finished reading it, and I do recommend it very strongly. I think it's a very interesting alternative take on essentially the same subject.
Right. Couple other questions musically. I wondered from the parts I've heard and from the first set of excerpts that you shared with us, if another very neglected area isn't represented too, and that's Polish 20th century music, Szymanowski in particular, with this shimmering sound. I mean, how many times can you see one of his operas? At Santa Fe 2-3 years ago, they did King Roger with Majeski, who was just a wonderful Don Giovanni. And to what extent do you think pre-Soviet Russian experiences are in Weinberg's musical?
I think you will hear elements of Mahler, you'll hear elements of Berg, Szymanowski, yes, absolutely. And incidentally, hopefully Chicago audiences will have a chance to hear some Szymanowski in a few years' time, at Lyric, I mean. But at the same time, I think Weinberg has very much his own identity, very much his own musical signature that I think is very recognizable in The Passenger. If you're curious to hear more Weinberg, well, as you'll see from this, our series of activities around The Passenger, Memory and Reckoning, will give you opportunities to hear some of Weinberg's music. The Orchestra at Northwestern is programming some Weinberg in its concerts. Members of our orchestra are playing some Weinberg chamber music at the Holocaust Museum in Skokie and elsewhere. Also, that extraordinary cultural resource of our time, YouTube. If you go onto YouTube and you put in Mieczysław Weinberg's name, you'll be amazed at how much of a panorama of his works, both symphonic and chamber music, you'll get from just spending a half an hour on YouTube. He's a fascinating composer, and for me, very accessible. I think his music is immediate. I think it's melodic. I think it has a haunting power that will stay in your memories for a long time after you've heard it.
The director of orchestras at Northwestern, Victor Yampolsky, his family went east and then west, and Victor knew of Weinberg's music as a kid and as a student in the former Soviet Union. So again, there's also this way that things come around. I want to ask you a couple more questions about the production, and then I want to go back to some of your own connection with this. The lighting design must be very important in this, even from seeing video with lights on it. Who is the lighting designer?
The lighting designer is Fabrice Cabour, a French lighting designer, brilliant, I must say. And yes, the whole design of the production, with the top half of the stage being gleaming white and representing the ocean liner, and the bottom half of the stage being much darker, representing Auschwitz, is, I must say, a brilliant piece of masterly stage design, both in terms of the sets by Johann Engels, the costumes by Marie-Jeanne Lecker, and Fabrice Cabour's lighting. It's a truly fantastic piece of theatre design. And as I said before, I'm particularly excited that team is doing our new Ring cycle, because I think you will see in The Passenger why I was so keen to persuade them to create our new Ring.
In addition to all the excellent material up on the website, another area of lyric opera, lyricopera.org, another area that Anthony has paid a lot of it, and his team have paid a lot of attention to. If you just type in the name of Johann Engels, Johan, Engels as in Marx and into another invention, Google, he was a South African, although he had adopted Britain as his home and Bath, as we say here, as his hometown. There's a very good interview with him recently in a South African classical music magazine. And if you type in Johann Engels, it'll pop up, I think, right away, but if you type in Passenger or Patner, I've also linked to it. And you get a sense of how this man's mind worked as he's describing that whole process. And you can see also why Antony was so excited both to work with him on this and on A New Ring. And I believe, Antony, that you've said that Johann Engels did finish the designs.
The designs,
for the new
set
ring.
designs are finished. The whole team is due to be in Chicago in a few weeks to give us a full design presentation for the ring. And earlier this week, the set models were packed in Johann's studio, ready to be shipped to Chicago. And
I want to come back to wrap up a little bit to your journey. And I should also mention, if you type in Antony Freud and WFMT, you can listen to a 2-hour program we did with music where Antony talks about really much of his life from beginning till now. And it's a fascinating story and, of course, wonderful musical selections. But you grew up with the refugee experience, both conscious always, but not belabored, is my understanding. From our very first conversation on the phone before we'd even met, yeah.
My mother always talked about her experiences in Auschwitz. I don't remember a time when I didn't know what Auschwitz was. I don't think she belabored it, as you say, but I think one of the reasons why I don't think I have suffered from the second generation syndromes that one reads about being such a difficult experience for many second generations of Holocaust survivors is her openness about it. And I went to Auschwitz after my parents died. I had long since wanted to go and never got round to it. And then ultimately, as I was clearing my parents' house, my mother died in 1990 and my father died in 1998, and they were extraordinary squirrels. They kept everything. They kept credit card bills, electricity bills, everything. And so clearing their house was a mammoth task and not a particularly inspiring task. And I was going through box after box and getting to the point at which I was thinking, I'm just going to throw the lot out. I can't be bothered going through it in any more detail. And as I was having that thought, at the bottom of the box that I was clearing at the time, in my mother's handwriting was an envelope that said, passes, ID papers, etc. And I opened the envelope, and inside were my mother's liberation papers, her certificate of deportation, that gave the date of her deportation, that gave the prisoner number, the barrack number in Auschwitz-Birkenau, the date of liberation, and the various ID papers that she was given, because with the hundreds and thousands of liberated concentration camp survivors being in effect stateless with nothing, the British control authorities and the other occupying forces control authorities had, as a matter of emergency, to give identification papers to these people. And my mother, I think, had forgotten they were there, because had she remembered, she would have shown them to me and talked to me about them. And at that point, when I found these, to me, treasures at the bottom of this box that had contained nothing but trash, I thought, no, I'm going to go through this box by box, and I'm not going to take any shortcuts. And it was really finding those papers and finding specifically her prisoner number, her barrack number, that made me think, well, no, now I'm going to have to go to Auschwitz, go to Birkenau, and explore. And it was a fascinating experience, I must say. I went between Christmas and New Year, and so the place was deserted. There was thick snow on the ground, and I was basically wandering around entirely on my own. There was few, if any, other tourists around. There were actually 2 women's camps in Birkenau, and it was impossible to tell which of the barrack numbers that was on my mother's certificate was actually the place where she was imprisoned. And I went to both. One was razed to the ground, the other was still standing. And obviously they were doing some renovation work in that particular barracks, and there was a pile of clearly original bricks in the corner. And I took one. It's the only time in my life I've ever stolen anything. But I thought, I'm entitled to this brick. And what was interesting about the whole experience, yes, of course it was an emotional experience, but it wasn't a disturbing experience. Because of my being first generation British, now being an American citizen, I'm comparatively rootless, I guess. My parents hated Hungary. I was not brought up to feel in any sense emotionally tied to Hungary, where they came from. And so to a very real extent, Auschwitz was an important part of my roots, and certainly something that I always associated with my mother. And I suppose when I finally went there, I felt that in the context of life's journeys, my relationship with Auschwitz was an important moment in my roots to discover and to, ironically perhaps, be inspired by. And that has stayed with me ever since.
One of the many reasons to continue talking with fascinating people, or with any people, is you hear things you didn't hear before. And though Anthony and I have talked about this particular subject a number of times, I'd never heard that story. And that story really fits, as he indicated, into this whole thing. We all wander around snowy places by ourselves, but we're also never wholly alone and never wholly disconnected. And to have Anthony share not only the story of the passenger, but his story of the passenger and his own story, and to let us share a bit in that brick that connects Anthony with all of these things, has been a very, very special experience. So please join me in thanking Anthony Freud.